Hi, everyone, and welcome to the 111th episode of the Atlas Society Asks. My name is Jennifer Grossman. You can call me Jag. As you know, I'm CEO of the Atlas Society. We are the leading nonprofit introducing young people to the ideas of Ayn Rand in fun, creative ways like graphic novels and animated videos. Today, we are joined by Chris Stewart. Very excited to have him on, and I'm going to introduce him. But before I do that, guys, start queuing up your questions, whether you are watching us on Zoom or on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, LinkedIn, YouTube. You can use the comment section to start typing in your questions. Keep them short, and we'll get to as many of them as we can. So our guest, Chris Stewart, is Chief Executive Officer for brightbeam, an education nonprofit focused on child justice. Stewart's past roles include CEO for the Wayfinder Foundation, Executive Director of the African American Leadership Forum, and a publicly elected Minneapolis Board of Education member. For a decade prior to entering philanthropy and public policy, he worked directly with families in poverty through public and private organizations. The Bush Foundation named Stewart a 2014 Leadership Fellow and a 2019 Pahara Aspen Fellow. Chris serves on the boards of Ed Navigators and Great Schools. He blogs and tweets under the name Citizen Stewart and publishes at citizenstewart.com. He is based in outstate Minnesota. Chris, welcome again. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
So first, I'd love to start with a bit of your backstory, your origin story. Where did you grow up? I know you moved around quite a bit growing up. So tell us a little bit about that, and what was the trajectory that brought you to where you are today?
So in that first part, the origin story, it is a transient childhood that I had. I grew up I was born in California. I was there for a few grades, the early grades, moved to Louisiana. So did a portion of elementary, middle, and high school in New Orleans. And did fourth grade in Minnesota and fifth grade in Los Angeles, of all places, and then back to Louisiana again. So it was a strange K-12 career. I wasn't in the same school, I think, more than a year in all those 12 years of school. So I had a very interesting connection to my education or lack thereof. When you talk about the trajectory, though, of how did I get here today, I mean, what I talk about mostly is education. I'm really focused on autonomous education mostly, but, I talk a lot about educational choice and options and pathways so that every kid can find themselves in schools. That trajectory of how I got here really started when I was 22, when I became a dad. And I kind of discovered at a very early age that I was responsible for someone else. And I knew very little about public education. I knew very little about schools, but I did know all the ways that it could go wrong because of my own experience. So had I not become a parent, you and I might not even be talking today. We might, I might be living some other lifestyle, some fabulous lifestyle that I'm not living right now. But it really started when I put my oldest into kindergarten, and I thought to myself, the crappy type of jobs that I'm doing in life, the kind of my job outlook, the things that I have going on are not really going to do a lot for my kid. So I'm going to have to figure this thing out for him, if nothing else. And little by little, like year by year, I became the more dangerous parent, more dangerous for the system, I should say. I learned more. I took it on really like a student. And I really, I did first grade and mastered it, did second grade and mastered it with my kid, and became an activist. And, after a while, I started helping other parents, started, getting involved in policy battles with the schools, the school board. And that's really what got me here.
Well, speaking of those jobs, I think you mentioned at some point on a recent podcast that you've had more than 40 different jobs over the course of your career. You don't look old enough to have had that many jobs,
I've
but
had a lot of jobs.
what were some of those, and how did they prepare you for what you do today?
I did a lot of retail, a lot of food service, hospitality, hotels. I did Sears, Pennies, Marshall Fields. I was an elf one Christmas for Christmas. What else did I sold magazines door to door, and a traveling group quit in the middle of my day shift in 100-degree heat in Nevada. I sold Cutco knives. Man, if I really had to go through the whole thing, it's a lot of different things that I did. And, how do those play into, who I became and what I do now? It was all a hustle. It was all trying to move up a leg. It was like, I was never going to be satisfied whatever station I was in. When I moved to Minnesota, I remember this. I've been in Minnesota all of my adult life. They were basically giving away jobs when I moved here. When I left California, and this is like, teenage years. When I left California, you couldn't buy a job. Like the job market was so terrible there that I remember the last job I applied for was at a place called the Pepper Mill restaurant.
Yeah, I think I remember that.
Do you remember the Pepper Mill?
Mm-hmm.
And I applied for a busboy job and had lots of experience in everything in the restaurant business, and didn't get it because there were like 40 people. So I took a Greyhound bus to Minnesota, and I had a job in 2 days, and I had 3 jobs in a week. And I remember just walking through the mall. It was like they would interview you and ask you when you could start, and literally they meant like when could you start? And that began my hustle. That began my like, oh, this is a lot of opportunity here, and totally different lifestyle than I had in California. I had a place really quickly, but I hustled. If I was the shift manager today, I wanted to be the store manager, shortly after that. And that's where my sights were already set. So work was the big thing for me. Education was going to be the big thing for my kid. His work was going to be education.
Interesting. So I was saying it seemed impossible that you did 40 jobs, but if you were working 3 jobs at a time, then I guess that could help to fill it up. And your story reminds me of a colleague that I had when I worked at Dole Food Company, and the company was going to move him from California to North Carolina, and his wife was managing a very successful restaurant here. And I said, well, what are you going to do? What is she going to do? I mean, you're kind of moving into the middle of nowhere. And he said, oh, well, she'll just take a job as bussing tables or whatever, washing dishes. Within the year, she'll be running the place. So I love that kind of, confidence. If you're good, you know that you can make it happen. If not in this place and this job, then you'll hustle and be entrepreneurial and find the next one. All right. So also speaking of your evolution, we can kind of get with your experience, largely negative experience with education and the system, and then really becoming the CEO of your child's and your children's education. But sort of politically, and I understand you're still in evolution, and I love that. But you voted for Nader twice. You were drawn to Jesse Ventura. So maybe talk a little bit about how, maybe what kind of politics you were brought up with, if any, and then how you began to hustle, and kind of think entrepreneurially about what really fit in terms of you.
Yeah, the earliest that I can remember with politics was really, not party politics, but it was more based upon community politics. So like it was a big deal when Dutch Morial ran to be the first Black mayor of New Orleans. And it created a lot of excitement and energy in the community of people. I didn't really know anything about parties or politics other than, this is how you get involved. So I can remember being part of the excitement as a kid, and going to things with the adults in my life around that race. And when he won, it was like this watershed. It was like this glow, like, oh my God, we won something. And I just remember, I can't remember exactly how old I would have been, but it was my first time ever feeling like, oh, you participated in the process somehow and you won. And this is what it means to win. And you have this glow and this feeling about it. And it was based on community politics, African-American politics, the ascent to power, the desire to make progress and to be free. And that's what I felt about it in those earlier years. Later years, man, when I was 12 or 13, and, in prep for this, I had to go back and think through some of this because I actually wondered if I voted for Nader 3 times and not twice. I couldn't remember who I voted for the 3rd time. But when I was 12, I remember for some reason glamming on to John Anderson, who was running as an independent in 1980. And I don't know why. I don't know how I came about it, but I just liked somebody being different. I just liked somebody who didn't sound like the other guys. And I still don't know very much about John Anderson. I remember like writing him into an election at school that we had and really following him throughout that race. And then Reagan won. And, I didn't remember much more after that. I only say that because it foreshadows what came later. By the time 96 rolled around, I was really disenchanted with what Nader called the duopoly. And I just didn't feel like it was that you had to choose one or the other. And I wasn't bought into the politics of this or that, either one or the other. And his platform around things like good government, transparency and all those things really resonated with me. And he was able, because he was an outsider, and I wouldn't have known this then, being kind of, young in my thinking in politics, I wouldn't have known this then, but he was freed up to say a lot of things that other people couldn't say, just because I think he knew that he was such an outlier, so far outside. I was one of those people that really believed it could happen. Right. Like looking back now, I think that's kind of funny, but, I was a true believer that this really could happen and that he could win when I say this could happen. And he didn't win, of course. And, I can remember a second time around and getting a lot of pressure from people, like, because the stakes were higher when it was, Gore versus Bush. And how could you dare vote for a third party? And how could you even think about it? And the Jesse Ventura thing came around. And I was a volunteer on Jesse's campaign on some things, and I got very invested in it because I thought that he was really speaking the best vision for Minnesota at that time as a governor. And I can remember working in a place where it was evenly split between Republicans and Democrats in the office that I was in at that time. It was a place called Access Cash. We were the first kind of people to deploy, apropos to your symbol there, ATMs into businesses, and people were pressuring me at work from both sides. Come on, Chris, you can't be serious. The guy's not going to win. I mean, he's a wrestler. He's not serious. The stakes are too high. Pick a team. It was that sort of thing. So I had Republicans and Democrats kind of saying that to me because the race was very close, very, very close. So after he won that next day, walking into the office, I mean, I could have just like strut no bigger coming into the office the next day, and no one wanted to talk about it. No one wanted to look at me. Jesse Ventura was, it was a great campaign to be involved with. It was one of the smartest visions. It was very smartly won. And he was one of the better governors that we ever had. And it was precisely because he wasn't owned by the duopoly on either side. He formed a very common sense government. And I can remember within weeks, he sent us a rebate check because we had a surplus. And instead of spending the surplus, he sent everybody a check. And I can remember getting that check being in between paychecks and thinking, my vote worked. Like my whole thing, this is material politics in action. This is the real deal here. And he governed very smartly after that. He didn't build a lot of party. He didn't make a lot out of it, out of his win, which he could have. And the duopoly spent all 4 years trying to make sure it never happened again. and actually collaborating to make sure that there would never be a third party win again. But yeah, that spirit never left me. That was way back then, and that spirit has never really left me.
I want to remind everybody who's watching, please go ahead, type your questions in. This is a really wonderful opportunity to chat with Chris. He's got a very different perspective than just the standard right wing, left wing, even libertarian. I found it very refreshing, but also just want to get into the meat of his work. And I was really intrigued by this study that Brightbeam came out with a couple of years ago. It was called "The Secret Shame: How America's Most Progressive Cities Betray Their Commitment to Educational Opportunity for All." So let's get into it. What did you find, and what was the reaction to your findings? And I'm also going to ask our team to put the link to that study in all of the platforms, because it really was shocking, I have to say.
Yeah, well, I wasn't really shocked, but the Secret Shame, our report came out a few years ago, probably about 3 years ago. Now, we looked at the top 50 conservative cities and the top 50 liberal cities or progressive cities, and we narrowed them down. I think we had a very long list from MIT that rated municipalities based upon how progressive they were or how conservative they were, and they had a criteria for it. I think we narrowed it down to the top 12 on both sides to study. We did work with Pat Wolf at the University of Arkansas, and we had some PhDs kind of crunch numbers and look at it. And when I say it, I mean, we were looking at student achievement and the achievement gap, the gaps between subgroups in those cities. And lo and behold, the progressive cities had larger racial achievement gaps than the conservative cities. I'd be hard pressed to remember all of the cities off the top of my head, but places like Virginia Beach had virtually no achievement gap, racial achievement gap, in comparison to places like San Francisco and Portland. And, you go down the list, and the report really came out of me doing a lot of traveling, making a lot of speeches on education. And everywhere I would go before I would make the speech, I would pull their numbers so that I could incorporate it into my speech and give them a little feedback about their city. And I live at the time, I lived in the Twin Cities, which is a very progressive, college educated city that has really terrible outcomes when it comes to kids of color, and has for decades. And then I went to Seattle, and Seattle did the whole hold my beer routine. They're like, we're even wealthier. We have even more college educated people than you do. And our kids of color are doing even more poorly than yours are. It's kind of like really dispiriting. How can that be? How can you have a city that prides itself on progressive government from top to bottom, all the resources that you could possibly want, and you're getting your clock cleaned by some of these smaller cities and other places in the South, of all places that don't have your politics? The story just repeated itself. I would go to San Francisco, I'd go to Oakland, Austin, and the story of progressive cities that had a lot of wealth, had a lot of booming businesses, had mayors that bragged of a world-class economy, couldn't get kids reading. And by kids, I mean, couldn't get their kids of color reading on par with their white kids. Meanwhile, you looked at this list of conservative cities, and it was the opposite. I wouldn't say it was the exact opposite, but I mean, they were doing better.
Right. There was a couple, I remember a couple of exceptions, but I guess what I found shocking was the size of the gaps. That was like in San Francisco and Washington, D.C., that the gaps were just totally unacceptable. And so what kind of reaction did you get people were progressive educators or education officials? Were they embarrassed? Were they, did they say, well, this is not true? Or did they ignore you? Like what happened?
They said, you're absolutely right. We're going to change immediately everything.
Just give us more money?
They didn't say any of that. No, they people were appalled in a lot of cases. People who weren't even really deeply connected to the issue or to the story just didn't want that story to be told about the cities that they were in. There's this really weird thing too. If you think about it, in a lot of these places that I was talking about, this precludes the private school population. In a lot of these uber progressive, very wealthy cities, you have very high private school participation. So that means that this wasn't just about economics either, because this was, the gap between the kids, the better off kids that were still in the system and the other kids. This wasn't, all the city's kids, right? So like other places, that have lower private school participation, there was just this real kind of head in the sand. A lot of buts. Yeah, but we have more kids that have special education, and it's like not than some of these other places you don't, we have a lot of kids in poverty, not more than some of these other cities that we're looking at, you don't. But there's an unwillingness to really face it, because I think what a lot of people know is to change what we found, there has to be some changes to the structure of the system, to the structure of the rules, the work rules, how people teach, why they are there, how they are there, how long they're there for, how budgets are done, all of that. And that's not going to happen anytime soon. So because of that, you have to come up with many kind of defensive strategies for getting around the truth. But there's just no doubt about it. You're in California. San Francisco doesn't have a lot of Black kids. I think it's like 7 or 8%. It's one of the wealthiest counties on planet Earth, not just in California. It's one of the wealthiest counties anywhere. And it's one of the worst places in California for Black students. Like, I don't care what excuse you have about that. As a mayor, and that's really the reason for the report, was we wanted to put mayors on the hook for not just saying you're a world-class city, but actually running your city like you are a world-class city, which means that you have world-class kids. You have kids that actually can really do well. How can you be the mayor of a city that is the wealthiest damn near anywhere, and in your state, you're really kind of sucking wind in comparison to cities with less money?
So the report shines a bright light on this striking correlation, but it doesn't really get into causation. And was that sort of a conscious, strategic choice? And I guess, at some point, don't we need to point to what's causing the failure in order to come up with solutions?
Yeah, I think the most honest that I could be about an answer to that is first of all, yes, it was intentional to not kind of like be lazy about making causal links to anything, specifically because then you start having to really match up cities in a different way, to like really look at all the different things that are going in their cities that could get so complex that it wouldn't lend itself to doing like a 1-year study. It would lend itself to having to do multiple years of study. Or you could do like a deep dive in just like 1 or 2 places and really go deep in those places. And we didn't set out that way. That still could be done. You still could do that. But listen, there are things nationally that we know that always will be true, always be important. How you teach, what you teach, who is teaching, how they were prepared, how they're evaluated, how you use data, how you understand the outcomes and do something about the outcomes when you see them, and how you intervene. Those things will always matter, no matter where you are. A lot of places have so much fancy stuff going on. They've got a department for everything. They've got a chief and a head of everything. And you have some little small schools in the South in some places where they've got a very simple thing going on, right? They've got well-prepared teachers who've been there for a long time, veterans who know what they're doing, and stuff doesn't change every year. And they don't have a director of everything and, whatever. And it's easier when you're in that type of environment than when you're in one of these big, large kind of bureaucratic environments that has no coherent educational philosophy, doesn't have a high doesn't have a high focus on outcomes, for instance, but more of a focus on how adults feel and how adults in the system are treated, not how the kids are doing. Not a lot of pride of ownership in the institution. And one big major thing that you can't get away with, even where I live in Minnesota, that you can't get away with, which is this kind of idea of, oh, listen, poverty is destiny. Like we just need more money. We need more resources. The kids are poor. Don't expect us to do much with them. Right. And that's a illiberal kind of way to look at life. That's very deeply embedded in the progressive education workforce.
Mm-hmm. Is there something kind of racist about it, that they're, saying, well, it's these kids that are, of this race, and so don't expect us to get better results? Is there some of that?
I think it's absolutely classist and racist and untrue. I don't think your brain stops being elastic because you don't have a ton of money. I don't think that our poverty is anywhere close to what poverty is globally in places where kids are still learning to read, and there's still Asia, Asia and Africa. I mean, there's places in this world where kids are sitting on dirt floors and learning to read and acquiring language and becoming proficient in math and in formulas in ways that we are saying that we have many in our workforce who believe can't be done with America's first world kids that are living in relative poverty. Like, I just want to point that out. When we say free and reduced lunch, that's our marker for poverty in the United States. That free and reduced lunch kid, globally speaking, would be considered, I don't want to go down that path too far, but I'm just saying, yes, poverty is real, and it has some attendant things that come with it that make it harder for kids to acquire their learning in school. Yes, absolutely. At the same time, you can learn to read. You can become proficient. When we talk about proficiency in the United States, let's always remind ourselves that's a very low bar. That is a very low bar. When we have school districts that have approaching basic, approaching proficiency, kind of proficient, almost proficient, right? Like, when you get to that proficient goal and that bell goes off, I just want to remind people that's still a very low bar. So we're not getting to even a very low bar with kids who are perfectly capable of learning. Like, they could do it. So
I'm going to get to some of these questions that are pouring in shortly, but I still have a few. One of the issues that we've focused a lot on over the past couple of years have been the lockdowns and the school closures, and sounding an alarm very early on that seemed, as public policy officials seem to lose the ability to think in terms of trade-offs, right? And so this was our emergency priority, and we're going to do absolutely everything to try to minimize infections and deaths, but no thought about what are we doing to kids, what are we doing to small business. So I want to talk a little bit even about your own sort of pandemic and lockdown experience as the father of five, not yet the grandfather, but I know you're working on that. And also just from the data and the research that you're looking at, did these public policy interventions have a disparate negative effect on children of color?
Yeah, I would say that almost everything that we have seen says to us that the pandemic was not good for any group of kids, but the groups of kids that fared the poorest are not something that you would not imagine already. Kids who were already behind, kids of color, kids in poverty, kids in schools that already were not doing a great job of keeping them on task and getting them, keeping them on trajectory, definitely fared a lot worse. And that's just, I hate the way that people use that statistic to say that one kind of public policy intervention versus other, or school closings or whatever, was the reason. Bottom line, let's just be adults. Pandemics are not good for anything. They're not good for business. They're not good for education. They're not good for learning. So there's a large element of duh to every time I hear this. Well, kids fell behind. Well, duh, they fell behind. They were at home for big parts of the years. They missed foundational skills. They missed foundational lessons. And it's hard to go back and fill those in if you don't go back and fill those in. So now we have this massive remediation project, which people are rebranding as an acceleration project. But we always knew we were going to have that. I said this from the very beginning of the pandemic. Start thinking ahead, think forward. 2 years from now, this is going to be a problem. 5 years from now, this will be a problem. 10 years for this will be a problem. Because I am a sentient being who understands how things work, I'm just thinking you might want to get on the ball and start thinking about the future. No matter what your policy intervention is, pandemics aren't good for kids. I have a different attitude about it. I know there were all these fights where, you close the schools, so therefore kids fell behind. I have kind of like a non-committal response to those type of what I feel like are really just partisan political kind of things that people get into and rouse themselves up around. The bottom line is I saw lots of different things happening. I saw, for years, school reformers had said, if we ever had a national Katrina, meaning if we ever had a situation like that when Katrina struck New Orleans, where we could completely remodel the schools, we could completely start, with the new school system like they did with charter schools in New Orleans, that would be our moment. This is what, and it wasn't a great thing to say, but this is what a lot of reformers said. And that moment came, and it was, okay, you guys are on now, spotlight on. I mean, the government gave you all your kids back. The government said, we got nothing for you. You've been telling us that we're no good for years, and turns out like we really got nothing for you right now. We can't get our systems up, we can't get our lights on, we can't get our staff back in the buildings. All the things that you said about us for years and years and years, turns out when the lights went out, they were kind of true, and we've got to figure out whatever we can figure out. So what do you guys have? And you saw the emergence of some things like educational co-ops, collaboratives, pods, homeschooling, a deep rise in homeschooling, collaborative homeschooling, where parents were trading shifts with their kids or whatnot. Some unschooling. Some people just what would be the worst thing that would happen if if my kids just weren't in this grind for a bit of time, they just read at home or whatever. So I saw this differently than a lot of my friends that were starting to get on the front lines and say the schools must reopen, and how irresponsible of you to not reopen the schools and everything. It was the first time I'd ever saw conservatives admit that the schools were so vitally important to everything. 10 days before the pandemic, most of the conservatives in my life would have said something along the lines of, the schools are so bad, man. If you just give the kids an iPad and send them home and say, have at her, that'd probably be better than what they're getting at school. Pandemic comes and suddenly they're the biggest public school supporters ever in the history of mankind. Oh my God, what are we going to do? We got to get our kids back in the schools and get them reopened again. And I couldn't make any sense of it. I couldn't, as a long-term education activist who had been pelting this system with rocks for years, I couldn't get the conservative sudden swing to open schools. Traditional district open schools was the grand savior of Americans' children. That's just a different perspective coming from me, but that's the way I was seeing it,
That's a good point. I get the sense from what you just said and some of the other things that you've said that you were disappointed that this could have been a moment, that we had this Katrina conversation about what happened if there was this big shock to the system, and that it could have been more of a moment for school choice and all of the kinds of reforms that you've been working for decades. And so is that the case? And if so, is it because reformers weren't prepared or they weren't organized or distracted by other things? What's your sense of that?
So my sense of it is that for years, reformers lived on this idea that they were the innovators and they were bringing something new to the table. And innovation is actually a process, and it requires kind of skill sets, and it requires infrastructure and creative people. And I think they were bluffing for a long part of for all those years. And this was their moment to prove whether or not they had the good Silicon Valley kind of like, we could make this thing happen. We've got money, we've got smarter people, we've got smarter kind of ideas. We're all about the good old, innovation stuff. And, we've got money and funding and, everything else that we've been throwing into reform for years. I mean, this was the moment. Light went on. You're on stage now. Show us what you can cook up, like, quickly. We couldn't get kids broadband. We couldn't get like educational platforms, digital platforms in the hands of substantial number of kids to get them into safe harbor. My 3 kids actually had ruinous distance learning for their district schools. And as somebody who lives in this every day, I searched out every kind of possibility and found a few here or there. Mm-hmm. But if there were really smart people with some really kind of like wanted to put the college try in with a little bit of money and saw this opportunity for what it was, which was to convince many in America that something alternative could happen outside of the traditional system, I think they botched it. I think they missed a really big opportunity, and they're still missing it today. As a matter of fact, not all the kids have returned, for one. Not everybody is happy with the arrangements of what they have. But I think sometimes, charter schools are, 25, 26 years old. The school choice, the private school choice movement is, arguably 60 years old, whatnot. In that time, it was a lot of policy bluster, wanting to pass laws, wanting to get public money for things, wanting to be parasitic on top of the existing system, not create something that completely moves kids into safe harbor. I was saying things like, listen, you can make a low-cost private schools for kids in Africa, but you can't make it happen in the United States. Really? You can't do low-cost private schools in the United States? Why not? Like, we're the country that creates things, that builds things, that brings new things to market. Maybe 15 years ago, not everybody could have an iPhone, and now everybody can have an iPhone, damn near. Like, we find ways to get things into hands of people. Just didn't happen. It just didn't happen, and I find it a little bit depressing. And it actually this is going to be depressing for you, maybe, but it reasserted for me. I think the public education system and the district school system won this argument, because as of today, all those people who 3 years ago would have been saying everything that I'm saying was possible in the reform, now all those past reformers have conceded that the only thing that they care about now is open district schools. And they're going to vote on it this November. Who got the schools open the fastest and got all those kids back into the traditional system the fastest. That should say a lot to us in itself, that should say everything to us about how reform did.
Let's get to maybe a cheerier spot, and that's homeschooling. Don't want to make assumptions about how you feel about homeschooling and where that fits in the mix of the different options. That we'd like to see a lot more diversity in options for the diversity of kids and their needs and their interests and their, and their acuities. So we've seen a rise in homeschooling. Has there also been a significant increase in homeschooling for Black families? And what's your perspective on the trend?
Yeah, I think Black families are the fastest growing. They were before the pandemic. They were the fastest growing group of homeschoolers. Before the pandemic. The pandemic expedited it, and a lot of them haven't come back. And the Black homeschooling movement is pretty powerful now in terms of it's nascent and it's growing. I don't want to overplay it, but it's there's a lot more resources for them. There's a lot more fellowship and support amongst Black homeschoolers, especially social media has become a very powerful tool for people who previously wouldn't have been able to find each other or provide each other moral and technical support. And I think it's a very smart thing to do. I think that I think from birth, Black children are given a large series of all the wrong messages. And I think one of the healthiest things that you can do is not put them into the message factory. too early. I wrote something recently, and one of the lines in it that I wrote that got people a little bit upset was, I said, if America wanted to make sure that Black people never reach their full potential, there'd be no more efficient way to make that happen than to demand that we put our babies in the American public education system at age 5. And I believe that to be absolutely true. So homeschooling isn't for everybody. And it is for a lot of people who don't think that they'd be able to do it, though. Right. And there's more than one way to do homeschooling, which is, I think, what the pandemic showed a lot of Black moms and Black families is that you don't have to do it alone. So homeschooling, like where you just keep your kids at home just by yourself, but you have no cohort or no community, is not the only way to do it. And I just have to say, in my own household, we had 3 home for those 2 years. I really enjoyed them being home for those 2 years. There were things I just didn't have to worry about, didn't have to think about. There was all kinds of stuff that, when kids are in school every day, especially when you have multiples in the school system at the same time, it's like you're managing bullying, you're managing calls to parents, calls to schools, falling behind on assignments, a lot of those different things. When the 3 of them were home here every day, it's a little bit more work. And there was also, some peace of mind to it.
Yeah, and I do like trying to find some bright spots when it is a challenging situation. I had the chance to go up and take care of my elderly parents for a good part of the lockdown. So that was positive. At least it was for me. And I'm not sure. I'll have to get back to on how they felt about it. All right, we have got a lot of questions. I'm not sure if you can see them. Otherwise, I will choose a few. We've got James from Instagram. Basic question, I think important question, and that is asking you, what do you think is the most important aspect for a child growing up? This person says he feels it is a sense of stability.
Yeah, I think that's a really tough question, but I would say stability, security, safety, autonomy, teaching autonomy, teaching agency, teaching sovereignty are the things that I think are really important, because I focus so much on autonomous education, which is basically self-learning, like self-taught, being self-taught before you go to school or before you put your mind in the hand of someone else. I think those are really important things to start at home. I think those are the most important things, So
I think it's an interesting balance. One of our previous guests was Lenore Skenazy, and she's has her whole free-range parenting approach, and says that, yes, we need to provide stability and security, but not too much security, that this culture of safetyism, that by protecting our kids from all risks and from making mistakes, that we kind of deprive them of the opportunity to gain experience, to gain self-confidence and resilience, and that's could be part of what's feeding into some of the problems that we're seeing in higher education. Okay, My Modern Galt on Instagram asks, where did your drive and hustle come from growing up? Was it the way you were raised, or was it more of a sense of responsibility that came in after you had your first child?
Becoming a dad at a young age definitely made me do things I would have never done before. That's for sure. But up until that point, I think about everybody in my family. The number one thing in my family, more than college going, and I'm trying to think back, didn't know very many college graduates necessarily that I can think of, but everybody had a good job. And by good job, I'm sure everybody listening, when I say had a good job, people know what that means when you're in working class neighborhoods or working class communities. It can be a range of things. Like my uncle Raymond was a welder, which was a good job. He helped build the Superdome, and still a good job. He helped build the Superdome in New Orleans. And he had things. He had a truck. He had a boat. He had a place to live that was immaculate, that he himself took care of every single thing. My grandfathers on both sides could fix anything. Electrical, plumbing, any of that stuff in the household. Some of that got lost in translation through my dad's generation, but being around everybody who was in pursuit of a good job. I was taught that very early. Like, that's your job in life, is to get a good job, more than college, more than anything else. So that created a hustle. And then, when I left places where there was not a lot of opportunity, and then ended up in places where there was a lot more opportunity, the hustle kicked in like times 10, because it was like, oh my God, I can make so many more gains here than I could somewhere else. Minnesota turned out to be that place for me, because economy was much more booming here than it was anywhere else that I lived.
All right, Facebook, Maria Cummings asks, do you think that people focus too much at big party national elections versus who is running locally for their school boards and such?
I think so. I mean, like, local. I think it pays to pay attention to national politics and to participate absolutely on big matters of the country. But school board elections are the lowest turnout elections that couldn't have more responsibility over something more important to every community and to your household, your kids. Like, the idea that you have school board members who run unopposed and no one knows how they got there until there's a problem. And that's because like 7%, 8%, 12% turnout is good for school board elections. I think that's going to be different. I think if I'm a predicting person, I'm predicting over the next 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, that turnout's going to be higher than it had ever been for school board elections. But to answer the question directly, yes, I think it pays to put your, especially, this is what I want to say for all people who care about children. Pay attention while people are running for mayor, city council, and school board. And when you interact with them, ask them tough questions about what they intend to do to make sure that they have thriving children in their communities. And don't let them ever be elected without answering tough questions about that. Literally, what's your plan? Let's hear it. And your mayors have to stop getting elected without, with a bunch of platitudes about kids, but without a plan. This, what we talked about earlier with the progressive cities, their mayors couldn't be prouder of their cities that have just immoral kind of gaps in opportunity for the kids in their jurisdiction.
So in terms of saying these are the priorities, these are the questions you need to ask, is that a little bit of what you're trying to get across in the book that you and your 8 Black Hands podcast co-hosts recently published? Tell us a little bit about what the book, who did you write it for, and what are some of the tools in this toolkit of education?
Yeah, so we really wrote that, and it's a thin guide. We wanted to do something that we could get done fast enough, that was accessible and readable, with some clear guidelines for civilians, for people that don't live in education policy all day and don't do what we do, which is we're activists. So we think about it a lot, and we know where the targets are and everything. We wanted to write this for people who have kids in schools, who want to know from a parent's perspective, from a student's perspective, from a school leader's perspective, and a community member's perspective, how they could be best armed to really know what the keys are. What are the bottom line? What's the bottom line? What are the things I should be focusing on? What are the things I should be caring about to make sure that my kids thrive wherever I am, whatever level of kind of like understanding that I'm at, give me some clear guidelines. And that's what we wrote about. Okay,
great. So we'll also put that link where people can get the book in all of the platforms. This hour has really flown by. We have about 12 more minutes. And there are a lot of really great questions. I'd still like to get to some of them. Yeah. But there were, I just learned a lot in researching this interview and reading some of your previous articles, the studies. And one of the things that was kind of new to me, and I'd love to have you elaborate more on it, was your suggestion that part of the solution needs to be more Black teachers for Black children. And so what are we missing? What might I be missing about the possible downsides of white educators teaching Black students?
Well, first, the research just says that when Black kids have two Black educators in their lives, it changes the trajectory on a lot of really important statistics. Completion of school, fewer times being in trouble, less discipline issues, better academics, more achievement. We also have research that tells us that white teachers have very low expectations of Black students. So, and there's a couple of ways this plays out. You can take a teacher and tell them that a classroom full of kids are gifted and tell them that another class of kids are struggling and have it be the exact same kids, but whatever you tell the teacher before they go in the classroom, it will impact what they do with the kids after that. And with Black kids, one of the more chronic things that happens for them is that people lower the bars for them. They lower expectations, academic expectations in terms of coursework and things that they'll be able to accomplish. And those expectations fall far short of what the kids are capable of. And that's a real problem. What you see with Black educators in classrooms with Black students, not universally, but on average, is that some of that goes away. Like the idea that we're going to, let you get away with certain things that you would be able to get away with in another classroom. Some of that goes away. And that's really important in terms of, because one of the things about achievement, like nobody wants a football coach that, says, what do points matter? Like what does a touchdown matter? Right. You want the coach who's going to drive you and push you and make you, like with some rigor, go further than you would normally go. You get that more with Black teachers when you have same race classrooms for whatever reason. You can come up with whatever reason you want of why that happens. But there's a lot of teachers in their first year that report once they start teaching, they were never prepared for the kids that they actually are teaching. And, if you survey teachers, they say that like after their first year or second year. So they spend 4 years to 6 years in college learning about theories, Piaget and all these other things, right? And then they get in an actual real world environment and they have to actually almost have another education again. And part of that is a cultural education. So Black educators are very important. Black schools are important. Black school leaders are important. Black pedagogy is important. What I wrote in that piece, a week or so ago that I wrote about was prior to 1954, prior to desegregation, Black children were making gains. They actually were closing in the schools that were supposed to be so terrible because they were, all Black and segregated or whatnot. They're supposed to be so terrible. There's a lot of institutional knowledge in those schools that had been built up over time, including assessments, their own types of assessments that they were doing with those kids. They were closing the high school graduation gap, the test score gap, lots of things you wouldn't expect. The way that you read history, you wouldn't expect that. All of that was wiped away. So once there was like mandated integration, lots of Black schools shut down, Black teachers were fired, Black principals were demoted, and Black kids were sent off to schools that had to learn from scratch, how to teach them or what to do with them. That's something that's never recovered. That's a scenario that has never improved. Now we have let's say it's 6 or 7 total Black teachers nationally and 2% Black male teachers, which is really abysmal.
All right. I think this is a good question. We're not quite at the end, but Tamara on Twitter asks, is there a proper place for public schooling, or should we work to transition over to charter schools, private school model?
Well, charters are public. So I just want to start there. Charters are completely public schools. And they're part of the public school portfolio of choices, which includes magnet schools, charters, open schools, interdistrict schools, and all contract alternative schools. Those are all part of the public school portfolio. Excuse me. Here's what I'm going to say. Listen, because it'll be new for me in this way, just being this outspoken about it. If you had asked me a year ago, 2 years ago, or 3 years ago, I would have said completely not. I would have said, we've got to get all the kids out of the system and into the safe harbor of new schools and new educational learning opportunities. I think what the pandemic taught me and what most of the ed reform world is teaching me right now is there's absolutely more than a role. The role of the traditional district schools are central. to the education of American children. And everybody is agreeing on that right now, including some of the biggest anti-public school conservatives who shocked me by coming to their burning bush all of a sudden, after all these years of saying how terrible the schools are now. Their biggest marker now for success is how many kids they can get back in the regular schools and get them going again. That says everything. That should answer the question for people on the right, whether or not public education and public schools are central to American culture. Now that all their conservative politicians are saying the marker of success are which ones of us got our kids back in the schools the fastest.
Interesting. I hadn't looked at it that way, but you're absolutely right. I know you take a dim view of many of the recent Supreme Court rulings, but I wonder if you've given some thought to Carson versus Macon, in which the court ruled that Maine's exclusion of religious schools from state tuition program was discrimination against religion.
I don't know if it's a view or a position. I'm not an attorney, but I'm definitely somebody who has like activist tendencies around policy. So I care about what this does for people. The United States is an outlier in the world's nations that don't fund. I mean, most of our competing nations actually do fund religious education. They fund religious schools. They have some sort of central kind of way of saying how everybody can have their plural set of values and gods and creeds and different ways of still educating kids. But America's an outlier and always has been in this not funding private or religious schools. So it's something I welcomed. And
Did you send any of your kids to religious schools? Did you attend religious schools growing up? Among the many dozens of schools that you...
Sorry about that. For the audience to know, I'm still in the middle of a COVID case. So
I know. So that means this is why we're all the more appreciative. He's coming on. He was like, didn't ask to reschedule. He just said, hey, my voice might be a little... No,
we're going to power through it. No, so my oldest...
I'm almost, you're pretty electric. So if this isn't full wattage, I'm you might have blown all the circuits if we had you on completely full steam. This is Chris Stewart in his mellow COVID
haze
NyQuil.
So no, my oldest, we chose a charter school for him for a few years, and it was really necessary and it served its purpose. Other than that, our kids have been in traditional district schools. Actually, no, I take it back. So our oldest two boys went to not religious, but private high schools. They went to a high school in a college campus that was an international high school. That was a private school. And then after that, they went into a Benedictine college. So we've done everything. We've done traditional district public schools, elementary, middle, and high school. And we've done charter and we've done private. Yeah.
All right. Well, this is bringing us up. We have just another minute or two. Would love to know what's next for you. If you guys, if Brightbeam has any other studies in the works, how people can follow you. I think we've put most of those links to your podcast and to your blog in the chat. But yeah, what's next for you and how can people learn more and get involved and support your work?
You go to brightbeam.org, you can find our organization. If you find me on Twitter, Citizen Stewart, you will see me having a very public rethinking of things that I was very clear about for so many years, just because I think it's time for that. I will always care about educational options in the plural. Education, a pathway for every kid, a place to good for every family. Excuse me. I will always care about us keeping kids at the top of the policy heap. Yeah, and that's it.
Okay. Well, we didn't get much into your kind of political a continuing evolution and transition. But what I like is that, and I think it's important, it's very important to our sort of approach to open objectivism, which is that we can always find places of agreement. We don't have to agree 100%, and we should be able to, even if we're on different political poles or coming from different places, or we should be able to try to make a priority to have children be the center of the school system, and not have it be centered around the interests of unions and what have you. So adults, right? Adults other than their parents. I didn't mention Chris, but my early days on this issue, I worked for Ted Forstman and helped him to recruit John Walton, and that's when they started the Children's Scholarship Fund. And so that was it was exciting, and we were able to help a lot of kids in that first push, but also at the end of the day, it didn't. I'm not sure we could say it had long-lasting effects with the vouchers. So that's why I'm very grateful that there are people like you on the front line, hopefully continuing to, as you say, throw rocks at the problem that we tried to solve, weren't able to, and that keep at it, because there really isn't any more important priority. So thank you, Chris, and thanks for coming on. Get some rest. And again, if you're out in California, we'd love to see you. Thank you for all that you do.
Thank you.